So thank you very much, Vittorio, David, and Anna, for this kind invitation. I will try to speak about the origins of Literarische Einfühlung. So the title is a reprisal, because I think we have to study again and again, and many of the scholars here have studied deeply these beginnings. So in this talk, I propose an archaeology of Literarische Einfühlung, insisting on the fact that at the origin of the German theory of empathy are not only visual, optical, and spatial issues, but precisely literary phenomena. In particular, a genre, that of tragedy, and two concepts, so to say, two categories, namely das Tragische und die Tragik. There is also a literary birth of the theory of Einfühlung, and if today we have wonderful books on empathy in the novel, starting with Susanne Keen, of course, the question remains why the tragic and the tragedy have almost disappeared from the horizon of empathy, of the theory of empathy. All the great protagonists of the Einfühlung theory wrote fundamental works on the tragic and the tragedy, participating in the powerful debate of the fin de siècle, and not only in Germany. And they all included conspicuous chapters on these concepts in their systematic aesthetics, people like, you see, Leibs, Volkelt, and so on. The theorists of tragic Einfühlung confronted at least two other very powerful traditions of German aesthetics and literary theory between the end of 19th century and the beginning of the 20th centuries. That of the metaphysic, the so-called metaphysic of tragedy, think the famous Metaphysique der Tragödie by Georgi Lukács, which dates back to 1911, and that of the poetics and aesthetics of tragic drama, so the drama's play, which had their roots in German idealism and of course in Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and so on. I will limit myself to three examples. Theodor Leibs, you see in the slides of these books. Theodor Leibs, when he was still an unknown Breslau professor, published The Streit über die Tragödie, the controversy of the tragedy. Johannes Volkelt wrote a monumental Aesthetik des Tragischen, published in 18. I am speaking about these three books. The first is the book of Leibs, Der Streit über die Tragödie. The second is this monumental Aesthetik des Tragischen, 500 pages, and then also Karl Gross, who some still see as an outsider of the Einfühlung theory, but he is one of the most important authors, in my opinion. Above all, for his rootedness in the Darwinist tradition, for his focus on ethnographic comparison, and his early attempts at a statistical analysis of literature. He has written a book, Die Spiele the Menschen, where tragedy as drama, as play, has a great meaning. Whole theorists of tragic empathy try to converge on some issues. These are the normal issues of the theory of Einfühlung. First, to purify the discourse on the tragic and the tragedy from its metaphysical, historical, philosophical, and ethical contamination, and to focus on the aesthetic aspects alone. This is, as you know, Leib's position. But none of these of the theorists of psychological aesthetics has managed to fully distinguish these domains, metaphysics, history, and so on. Just look at the fascination that concepts such as catharsis or Mitleid, so discharge or compassion, exercise, and how some authors have tried. This is the case of Johannes Volkert, just to make an example, to combine metaphysics and psychology of the tragic and tragedy. Second, to work on an aesthetic of reception, that is the reader, an aesthetic of the reader and the spectator, and try to identify the psychological laws of the effect of tragedy in the wake of Gustav Theodor Fechner's aesthetic from below, without, however, claiming that this effect could be completely explained by an experimental or quantitative approach, and insisting, if anything, on introspection. Third, they insist on the fact that aesthetics concern the subjects, their selves, as we would say today, their Selbstgefühl, rather than aesthetic objects. And finally, fourth, they try to consider the tragic as a feeling, as an emotion, which does not only concern the tragedy, but concern all the other arts. Typically, sculpture, where the Laocoon is considered the apotheosis of the tragic, and concern even everyday life. This is well known among us, so to say. The feeling of tragic is a real feeling, and as such also present in real life. In this sense, psychological aesthetics is something profoundly different from a psychology of art. The central question for all these authors is expressed, just to make it only one example, by Emil Utitz in an essay on Das Tragische from 1920. I quote, "The strange, almost provocative question that the tragic confront us with is, how does pleasure spring from suffering?" Among the concepts they developed, and you see in the slide, there are many concepts, but I will discuss only three of them. So I select three concepts. The concept of psychische Stauung, which in Freud's standard translation is rendered as psychic damming up. The concept of Entlastung, not to be unburdening, not to be confused, or better, to be confused with that of Entladung, which is in German, we translate catharsis, discharge, and the concept of innere Nachahmung, innere imitation, or rather, better, I could say, inner mimicry. These concepts are the precondition of empathic experience, as you know, and my goal is to show that these are concepts which pose problems that are still relevant today and yet topical from a neuroaesthetic point of view, or as I prefer to say, from the point of view of biopoetics. So, psychische Stauung. Simplifying, we can say that the law of psychische Stauung, so this damming up, cycle damming up, which Lipps tries to define on several occasions throughout his career, especially in writings not devoted to aesthetics, derives from the law of contrast, which Gustav Theodor Fechner identifies among the first principles of his bottom-up aesthetics, together with those of sequence, Folge, and reconciliation, Versöhnung. Having organized his entire aesthetic, Fechner, around the concept of Lust and Unlust, pleasure and displeasure, the law of contrast can only be its natural corollary. It's no coincidence that Lipps also uses this category in his book Komik und Humor, eine psychologische ästhetische Untersuchung, which constitutes the companion piece to the essay on tragedy. Lipps, as we know, considers humor and not comedy to be the opposite of tragedy. Precisely in Comic and Humor, in fact, we find the first aesthetic application of the law of psychische Stauung. With a few variations, the same definition returns in the latter Leitfaden der Psychologie, to which Serge, for example, who is present today, recently drew our attention. I quote, "If a psychic event is interrupted or inhibited in its natural course, or if an alien element enters into it at one point, a congestion, damming up, happens. the tendency of the reflux of the psychic force and also of the lateral outflow of the psychic force in any new direction of the same, thus concentrates the psychic force in that point. This congestion, this damming up, happens at many levels in art, both in the form and in the content. In the Grundtatsachen des Seelenlebens, so the fundamental facts of psychic life, it is the form of interruption of the emotion. So the psychische Stauung is a kind of interruption of emotion. I quote from this wonderful book, "Tower bells ring, and I gradually no longer pay attention to it, so I completely overhear the ringing. Suddenly, the ringing breaks off, and now I know, well, that it has rang. I have a feeling of the congestion, Stauung, that arises from the fact that the last sound cannot flow into the following ones like the others." And then in Comic and Humor, 5 years later, it is first of all a form of intensification of pleasure through a denial, through a negation of the natural flow of emotion. So interruption and intensification. I quote again, examples of this psychic congestion can be found everywhere. Consider, for example, the effect of unexpected breaking off of a series of similar elements, which naturally points to a continuation. The sudden appearance of the clutter of the melody, the effect of the breaking off of a sentence or a narrative. As a special case is to be mentioned, the effect of negation of natural practical demands. For instance, the demands of the preservation and duration of a valuable object. So the tragic hero, of course. Serge has discussed this concept, considering, for example, the effect of estrangement, so ostranenie, in the theory of Russian formalists. So this interruption and intensification are the 2 points, the most important in psychische Stauung. The idea is that precisely the interruption, the contrast between the evolution of a situation and its brutal denial, negation, enhances the emotion. Above all, classically, tragedy is about the annihilation of something that has value, of the hero, who sees his value exalted in death, while we, the subjects of empathy, attribute an even greater value to the character who dies. This connection of value, which is cognition and emotion together for empathy theorists, and this is of course more important in our times to say, is what in classical aesthetics is called Mitleid, compassion, usually translated with pity, but compassion is the right translation in this context. Here, a classical term of German literary theory from the 18th century undergoes a singular semantic twist. Mitleid is not only a form of Leiden, of suffering, but above all, a kind of Wertschätzung, an attribution of value. In the Mitleid experience, we appreciate the allgemein Menschliches, which is the absolute value for us as human beings. Here, Lips resorts to the classic definition of Einfühlung. I quote, "I feel in increased measure myself and my human value in another. I experience or feel to a greater extent what it means to be a human being. And for this, suffering is a means. The feeling of human value that the suffering creates for me is sympathy." As you know, there are many wars to express in the history and in the development of Lips Einfühlung. Sympathy is empathy, Einfühlung, co-experience, miterleben. This sympathy is also already mentioned in the word compassion. Compassion, Mitleid, is sympathy. namely such sympathy that is awakened by the suffering. But every sympathy is in itself a feeling of value, and a feeling of value of the highest kind, namely a feeling of human value. And the hero is this, the death of the hero is this human value. Lips does not postulate the alternation of negative and positive emotion, but attempts to think of a sort of tertium datur, that is the coexistence of the two moments in a single mixed emotion. They are not successive emotions, but concomitant. To such mixed emotion belongs, for example, das Rührende, moving, touching, die Sehnsucht, nostalgie, die Wehmut, melancholy, and so on. And Lips suggest that even the tragic feeling must be classified among mixed emotion. Again, a problem for us today. Entladung, the second point. The theorists of Einfühlung have spent many words to demonstrate that catharsis, whatever Aristotle intended the concept to mean in his poetics and especially in his politics, was an extra aesthetic, außerästhetischen effect of tragedy. Catharsis, after Jacob Bernays, belong to the field of medicine, or rather of pathology, and therefore could not be considered could be considered only a side effect with respect to aesthetic emotions. Volkert himself, to whom we owe a highly original interpretation of catharsis, in a note from the 1917 edition of the Aesthetic des Tragischen, as Tobias Wilke recalled, argues with Alfred von Berger and Hermann Bahr and accuses them of having prepared the ground for the pernicious and trendy Freudian interpretation of art. So the catharsis in the sense of therapy. Freeing ourselves from fear, Furcht, and compassion, Mitleid, means going in the opposite direction to every form of empathy. In this sense, the theory of catharsis represented the denial, the negation of the aesthetics of empathy. However, if the cathartic effect applied to tragedy nullified the Einfühlung, an interpretation of the Entladung, which means catharsis, discharge, regarding the whole experience of art, seemed instead not only possible but also necessary. This mechanism of liberation, which some theorists attribute to the existence of quasi-emotions, Scheingefühle, others to the specific setting, the theater, the movie theater, and so on, is instead essential, necessary to understanding the aesthetic experience as a whole. The theory of Entladung imperceptibly transforms into a theory of Entlastung, of the Entlastung tout court, unburdening, relief, and thus prepares the way for one of the most important concepts of 20th century philosophical anthropology. The first step was to equate the experience of art with play, a issue to which Carl Gross devotes his two magnificent studies on play in humans and animals. I quote, "We can generally say that in play we are completely lifted out of the real life purpose. By entering the world of play, we step out of the everyday world of real life. We free ourselves from it. Finally, this is also the finest and deepest meaning of the recreation theory, Rollins theory. Because both play and aesthetic pleasure are hence in themselves, Selbstzweck, they also coincide in this shade of the feeling of freedom. They redeem from everyday life and from the everyday ego." Gross wanted to broaden also the notion of catharsis to the play and also to the drama tout court. interpreting it not as a form of a total Entladung, discharge, and therefore annihilation of emotions, but as a safety valve, Sicherheitsventil, which allows a partial and momentary, augenblicklich, discharge of emotion, precisely to prevent the effect of reality from prevailing in them, and the emotion becoming something which triggers the motor apparatus. The definitive transition towards an original interpretation of catharsis as unburdening, as Entlastung, was made by Johannes Volkelt himself. For Volkelt, as much for many of these theorists, our pleasure in the presence of a tragic situation is explained by the fact that negative emotions nevertheless activate our emotional life. They animate us, beseelen, and give us at the same time a relief, unburdening. Volkelt considers animation and unburdening, in the wake of leaves, of course, necessary for survival, a true blessing. I quote, "This is the blessing of the static mood, that we get rid of our suffering ego for a while." And further, mankind would be lacking something salutary if, in addition to science, religion, and morality, it did not also possess this good, art as intensification and at the same moment relief. Volkelt creates the premises for the anthropological theory of Entlastung, which has characterized modern philosophical anthropology. I'm thinking of Arnold Gehlen, Helmut Plessner, Hans Blumenberg, and Odo Marquardt, who made the aesthetic experience essential, necessary for the survival of Homo sapiens. Elsewhere, I have discussed this genealogy, which leads directly to Gallese and Wojciechowski liberated embodied simulation. Siri, just to make a poetic example, applies the concept of relief to her work as a writer, and therefore to her poetics, an aspect that we must not forget when we talk about empathy, as Petraska reminded us, so the voice of the poets. I quote, and this is a little homage to Siri. She writes, "Relaxation is vital to creativity. The best work is done when the whole body is relaxed in a state of openness," which is a category of Italo Calvino, of course, "to what lies beneath." Schiller's knew this. Siri knows everything about the origins of psychological aesthetics, so to say. Tension, anxiety, fear inhibit the release of essential material, the dream work or a kind of dream work that comes to light during the day rather than at night. So just read one of the most important passages of that I believe fundamental and challenging essay for the interpretation of narrative empathy, that is how stories make us feel toward an embodied narratology, Gallese and Wojciechowski, and we will hear the same articulation about relief and unburdening. So I don't need to read these wonderful words, we know them all. But with one significant caveat, however, Gallese and Wojciechowski invert, so to speak, Volkert's argument when they consider Entlastung not as a simple effect of aesthetic experience, but also as the precondition of what we call simulation for the purposes of aesthetic experience. For there to be an aesthetic experience, it is necessary for the body-mind system to prepare itself for that unburdening. This is possible in the concrete experience of reading or theatrical and cinematographic spectatorship and so on. Last point, embodiment. As is well known, in the same paper, Vittorio and Anna insist on what they call the feeling of the body, a crucial, I quote, ingredient of our relationship in fictional narratives and a precondition of empathy. As we know, Lips tended to underestimate the significance of the body in the Einfühlung, while other authors, such as, for example, Karl Gross, think that Einfühlung is first of all the result of the activation of the somatomotor system. Karl Gross proposed, in fact, an alternative term to Einfühlung, which is innere Nachahmung, inner mimicry. The ultimate meaning of the word inner must be fully grasped. It is a synonym of embodied. The innere Nachahmung is in fact a specific form of embodied simulation, to the point that the English translator of Gross, with the collaboration of the author, the play of man, does not hesitate to translate Einfühlung with embodiment, to cure, as you can see here in the slide. No? Einfühlung, embodiment, or inner imitation. After all, the approach of Gross' book is entirely interwoven with the reflection of embodiment, from the behaviors of children to those of the so-called savages, and play is obviously first and foremost a motor experience, the form of simulation and activation of emotions. The tragic, as a sublimation of play, is by definition a body-mind experience. Like all aesthetic experience, it is in Lipsian terms a form of activation and enhancement, Belebung and Steigerung. Starting from the second great theorist, so to say, of negative emotions after Aristotle, I mean St. Augustine, Gross argues, quoting St. Augustine, of course, argues that pleasure in negative emotion is caused by the intensive stimuli to which the body and the mind are subjected. Stimuli that may even be imperceptible and which nevertheless activate the sensory motor system. I quote, "There is still activity, and that in the common sense of the word as it relates to motor processes. It is manifested in various movements whose imitative character may not be perceptible to others. In this instantaneous perception of the movements actually in progress, I find the central fact with which blend, on the one hand, imitation of past experience, and on the other, the perception of sense. Inquiring concerning the complex movements of inner imitation or mimicry is not yet past its opening stage, but so much seems to be established, namely, that by it are called forth movement and postural sensation, especially those of equilibrium, like the muscular innervation, together with visual and respiratory movement, all of which are of great importance. So even if not perceptible to others, there are these movements, and we know that this is now true. For this reason, Gross is in full disagreement with Lips, as we know. So I will conclude now stressing these points by saying that this provisory reappraisal of some classic categories, but reading these categories in a close reading, really, and in the whole development of these theories, like Lips or Volkelt or Gross, and especially, of course, the psychological aesthetic of the tragic, could be can contribute even today to a theory of literary empathy, which I imagine will emerge in the following intervention of this conference. So thank you very much.